Welcome to the Stanford Silicon Valley New Japan Project Public Forum Series. We're a part of the Japan program in the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. And our project has several components to it. We mainly do public forum series with networking. We do a lot of research about Silicon Valley, how it works, and the ultimate objective is to raise the mind presence of Japanese companies that are doing interesting things and also help Japanese companies harness, make use of parts of the Silicon Valley ecosystem. And today, one of the things we'll be talking about is why that's so difficult. And it's difficult for not just Japanese firms, but Japanese firms tend to have a more difficult time utilizing part of the ecosystem. We do policy activities and various policy evaluation. We have study groups and research collaborations with various other universities and entities like UC Berkeley, the Keio Media School Design School, the OECD. A few months ago, we were in Germany and looking at how technology can be used to upskill workers. So not just IA replacing people, but AI replacing people, but IA, intelligence augmentation, taking people who are low skilled and allowing them to do high skill, things like this, and outreach activities. And our biggest outreach was, and I'll be talking about this a little bit, our Silicon Valley New Japan Summit, which was the biggest one this year. We did it in partnership with Ishin, and we had support from the Japan Management Association, and we had about 600 people, about 85 Silicon Valley startups, B-series round or later, and about 400 people from Japanese companies, about 150 companies, about 200 people came from Japan. And there were 2 days. One day was basically business matching, and then the first day was panels and discussion of various Japanese large companies on how they were able to do various things here. And those are some of the stories I wanted to share today. And this is a project that's only possible because of the generous support of a happily growing number of companies: Future Architect, Kozo Keikaku Engineering, Komatsu, Mistletoe, Canon, JX Nippon, Mining and Metals, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, World Innovation Lab, AKEL, ANA, Daikin, Denso, Development Bank of Japan, NTT Comware, Kawasaki Heavy Industries, Mitsubishi Corporation, Musashi Sakai Driving School, NEDO, Panasonic, Tech Firm Group, Tokyo Marine Group, and SMBC. So thank you for your generous support. And this is very interesting because part of the exercises that we do together, we learn a lot too. And so we reach out to a lot of what's happening in Silicon Valley. We distill a lot of it. We make connections, and then we talk to a lot of these companies. And then hopefully it's value added for them, so they'll continue to work with us. And at the same time, we get to learn their various pain points or internal structures where they have difficulty. So the vision for this is really a sustained platform for Stanford and Silicon Valley and Japan interactions. So that's the project. I'm Kenji Kushida. I'm a research scholar here at the Japan program, and I've led this project. And so today I have the great pleasure of introducing myself. And a lot of people like to have somebody else to introduce him, so it's like, okay, fine. Okay, so innovative Japanese companies harnessing Silicon Valley, part 2, because part 1, we ran out of time, and then we had the summit. So we're sitting on top of a lot more company cases that are interesting. And I'm delighted to say about 7 or 8 years ago, this would have been not possible because there weren't these companies here doing the interesting things they're doing now. So I'm actually very, very happy that we're in a position now to be able to do this kind of positive messaging, because I lived through about 15, closer to 20 years of most Japanese company talk or Japanese economy analyses done here at Stanford or in Silicon Valley or UC Berkeley were about why things didn't work. Now we can talk about things that are underway, that are different from before, that are starting to work. So it's very exciting. And I want to emphasize the positive parts of this. So the context, but here's an important thing that I've realized talking to a lot of people. We need to start when Japan mattered the most in global competition, the 70s and 80s, because depending on what generation you were, you knew all about this. But depending on what generation you might be, this wasn't obvious. If you're about 40, maybe about 45 or younger, basically the whole stories that you grew up with were all the reasons why Japan didn't work, why it was not the cutting edge, how things ossified, how Silicon Valley ate the lunch of a lot of traditional Japanese large firms without much focus on the success. So what were some of the successes? I'm shocked these days talking to students, undergraduates, for example, right? Yeah, Nokia, that was a great Japanese company. No, it was a Finnish company. And other companies where our friend from Panasonic was saying, yeah, he introduces himself and say, I'm from Panasonic, and the student, they're trying to be very polite, but he realized he has no idea what Panasonic is or what they do, right? Things have shifted. So I want to go through a few contextual things that are real details, and then that are taken granted by older generation who lived through it, but people who know about Japan's strengths. But actually, this is news to younger generation people, and it's interesting because we work with students and our research assistants, et cetera, who read about this, and they're quite surprised. We need to start with a positive message, then go to so we start with when Japan was strong, some specific details about Japanese large firms and strengths and the Japanese model per se. And we can do a quick overview of this. Then we're going to go to the rise of Silicon Valley because the high value added activity really shifted, and this has been the center of it, disrupting things. Then we go to the worst practices of Japanese firms attempting to harness Silicon Valley because the default behaviors of large Japanese firms end up being exactly the behaviors that work the least well here. But if we start with the third one, see, then it's a very different picture. So I think we have to start with the first one. And unfortunately, the worst practices series has gotten more and more traction. I wish it didn't have to. I'm hoping that the day comes where they'll say, yeah, this is a historical artifact. Nobody wants to hear this anymore, but that's still not the case. So, and then recent efforts, and this is the core of it that I want to spend the most time on. Innovative Japanese companies, lessons that we learned from the Silicon Valley New Japan Summit. When we started thinking about the summit, we were a little worried about being able to get enough cases and not the same people year after year. It turns out there's a depth of cases that we didn't realize existed, and more are created every year. So this is incredibly exciting. First, let's start when Japan was strong, right? This is old news to some of you. This is new news to some of you, right? 1978 semiconductors, right? But then 1984, the semiconductor world market share, the Japanese were rising, right? And so this was quite dramatic. Lean production, how to make manufactured things, particularly cars. A very famous 1987 study, which was documented in the MIT one, The Machine That Changed the World, the story of lean production. It really showed, they went into the logic of how Toyota lean production worked, and they realized that they needed to take data. They looked at various companies, various factories, and found some quite shocking data, and they were sort of evangelizing this, saying that the Japanese manufacturing production system is fundamentally different and fundamentally better than what GM and Ford and Chrysler were doing at the time. So they found that it required, even as of 1987, about less than half the number of assembly hours per car, less than half the defects, with only 2 hours of inventory compared to 2 weeks for the US factory. This is old news for some of you, but this is new news. And they looked at European high-quality German manufacturers and found that a lot of the German craftsmen was actually taking products at the end that had defects and fixing them, whereas the Japanese were rolling out cars that didn't have defects, so there was no real reworking area. And so this was a sort of paradigm-shifting book called The Machine That Changed the World. Now, a few other things, right? Autofocus camera. In 1962, Japan surpassed Germany as the world's largest manufacturer of cameras. In 1976, Canon pioneered the Canon AE-1, the first 35mm camera equipped with autofocus. And this was kind of a big deal. And again, there's this generation thing too, but it depended on the incorporation of highly sophisticated electronics, most notably a microprocessor, right? And it became the best-selling camera in the world, 70s. And CMOS and the handheld calculator, right? Calculators were these things that occupied most of people's desks, right? And then Sharp's vision was to make a handheld one. This required a large-scale integration, LSI and metal oxide semiconductor, LSI and MOS chip. Fairchild, right? That had grown out of Shockley Semiconductors, and was one of basically the core Silicon Valley company from which Intel, AMD, Kleiner Perkins, Mr. Kleiner, et cetera, came out of. They had been taken major steps initially, but nobody had been able to manufacture MOS integrated circuits. And Sharp was initially rejected by the leading Japanese firms. But in 1969, they actually approached a US firm, Autonetics, which was specialized in supplying the military. And they got a $30 million, they provided a $30 million contract to develop MOS LSI circuits. And then in 1969, they introduced the first MOS LSI equipped demo model in New York. Right, it was 1.4 kilograms, $277. Many firms, including Fairchild, remained quite skeptical. I said, what is this aeronautics, the military supplier, doing with a not well-known Japanese manufacturer? These are toys. And then Canon also entered the calculator market, and they procured chips from TI. So we see a lot of connections. There's sort of, in a lot of the simplified views of how Japanese industrial production sort of leapfrogged a lot of the US, a lot of focus is commonly on reverse engineering, stealing intellectual property, and then automobile production, lean production. But there's a lot of this other stuff as well that's worth highlighting quickly, because there's more to it than that. Right? The calculator market was a very significant, very competitive market. There were over 60 firms in the 1970s. In the end, only a few remained: Sharp, Casio, TI, HP, Hewlett-Packard down the street. And in 1980, of the 100 million units shipped, half were Japanese. Right? And Sharp was the first firm to use CMOS, which allowed them to actually realize it was very low power consumption, a handheld calculator. So this was, in the big picture, moving from computer processing power as a very scarce and expensive resource to something that's an abundant resource that you can use a lot, you can waste a lot, you can perform lots of calculations. And this is a trajectory that's continuing now, enabling AI and various things. So 1970, Hitachi, Mitsubishi, NEC, they were the most advanced chip makers in Japan. Toshiba was not. They were lagging behind. They approached Sharp, who recommended they focus on CMOS. CMOS integrated circuits, low power consumption. It went on to become a core technology of the entire semiconductor industry, and Toshiba was in the core of that. That was the Toshiba at its strong era. So they led the manufacturing of the first CMOS chips. And then the computer industry, they switched to CMOS in 1985. So they were positioned in an extremely strong position. And Silicon Valley semiconductor industry was, a lot of players were wiped out by this phase. Another one, semiconductor lasers, right? The antecedents included lasers that were made of transparent materials like ruby and afterwards gas. And in 1966, a senior manager at Bell Labs, along with, there was actually a Japanese person from Tokyo University, a professor was working there with it. But they were developing they're trying to develop a reliable semiconductor laser. And in 1970, they developed the first reliable laser source from semiconductors. However, AT&T management, they were not interested. They said, okay, this has limited applications. We're not a big deal. And so, but Bell Labs published these things. Japanese researchers clamored on and were very interested in it. And all the major Japanese R&D labs started looking at this. There was a big race to develop long-lasting lasers because they kept burning out. So interestingly enough, in 1983, AT&T was awarded a $250 million contract to design and develop the first transatlantic optic fiber submarine cable. To do that, they needed lasers to get the information across. However, Bell Labs didn't have a laser to be able to, they got the contract, but they didn't have the expertise to make it. So they actually sent a delegation to Japan. They went to NEC and Fujitsu first, but they were fully occupied supplying NTT with equipment. So this is a familiar pattern. So AT&T ended up buying lasers from Hitachi's Central Research Lab. And so that sort of brought them into the picture in a big way. And then laser printers. Right? We think Hewlett-Packard's one of its big historical successes was the laser printer. Interestingly enough, Canon was very, very involved in this. In 1972-73, Canon researchers developed the scanning laser beam, and they actually rented a booth at the National Computer Conference in New York, I think it was, in 1975 to demonstrate the new technology. And this very much impressed Bill Hewlett of Hewlett-Packard. And in 1971, Canon licensed the laser technology to HP. So one would have thought that it went the other way around, but it was actually this way. And then in 1978, since Hitachi was very good at making lasers, Canon visited them, and they wanted to build a personal copier. And Hitachi's lasers were basically the best. They were tiny, they were very power efficient, and they could, in theory, be made cheaply, even though they hadn't produced them in volume yet. So Canon and Hitachi worked closely to reduce the costs in order to use lasers in a mass market application. Of course, looking from the outside, people saw this as, oh, Japan Inc., it's collusion. These people are all working together. But what we're sort of portraying here is there was a lot of competition, right? Toshiba was behind, therefore they worked on things that with upstart companies that were not as deeply entrenched yet, like Canon or Sharp. So then laser printer. In 1979, Canon built a prototype laser printer. It was an engine small enough to fit on a desktop. Before that, they were big things. They adapted the cartridge from personal copiers to use for laser printers. Of course, this required a lot of clever engineering, and they happily set about to do this. And then Canon and HP set up an informal joint venture. Canon provided the engine and manufactured the machine, and HP developed the formatting software. So one could view this as HP relied on Canon hardware. One could also see this as HP had the high-value software part of this, and Canon's name didn't show up on the laser printer, which became Hewlett-Packard's one of its most successful products of all of its history. It was the first mass market application of the laser, and it was HP's most successful product ever. It used a Hitachi laser initially. And Canon went on to supply laser engines for Apple LaserWriter. And although Xerox had built classic pattern, right? Xerox had built the first laser printer in 1971. Xerox management hadn't seen the potential for selling to customers because they were B2B, right? So they said, what's the point? And then ceded it to HP down the street, which actually depended very much on Japanese technology, which commercialized and produced US inventions. So this is sort of the technology relationship that characterized historically a lot of Silicon Valley and Japan. And of course, I talked about this briefly last time, the microprocessor, right? Intel was the first, they produced the first commercially available microprocessor, and they went on to dominate the PC industry in terms of value. Initially, the microprocessor was developed for the Japanese calculator manufacturer, Nippon Calculating Machine Corp, NCM, better known here as Busicom. And Intel's contract was interesting because they wanted to make several IC chips that each did one function, but they couldn't make them at the cost that they had a contract with Busicom for. But then they realized that with software, they could have one microprocessor do the function of multiple integrated circuits. And Busicom said, okay, that's fine, we can do that. And then Intel said, but we will not supply other calculator manufacturers, but any other industry we're free to supply. And so Busicom was the exclusive procurer of the Intel microprocessor for its calculator, but it went bankrupt a few years later when the recession hit, and Intel was free to use the microprocessor as the core of what then the growing personal computer industry, and the rest is history. So in the history of Intel, Japanese company actually mattered a great deal. And then Sharp and lasers for compact discs. In 1989, Sharp developed a laser that emitted light at the CD wavelength, and it was very reliable. And Sony actually asked Sharp to make the lasers for them. And they worked to reduce costs. They introduced the introduction date was 1982. And so the Sony CDP-101 became the world's first commercially released CD player. Again, I talked to a lot of people here and they say, Sony, yeah, back in the day, they made the Walkman. This was a new product and it was interesting. It's a gadget, yeah, but it's beyond that too. And I also wanted to point this out. And so Rome. In 1984, a little-known Japanese component supplier, Rome, began selling semiconductor lasers fabricated using MBE, molecular beam epitaxy. It's a complex method, and it came as a shock to all of its competitors. People didn't think that MBE was ready for commercialization. But then by 1995, Sharp, Sony, and Rome would between them account for 90% of the $100 million semiconductor laser manufacturing market. And of course, after this, right, the next decade, that was almost completely supplanted significantly by non-Japanese companies. But at the point, this was the Japanese dominance as late as 1995. So again, looking into this was a surprise depending on where you stand. So MBE lasers, of course, were first developed by Bell Labs. And Bell Labs researchers published the technical papers arguing the case for MBE, but no one was interested in commercializing it. And that's when the Japanese companies came in, particularly a young chemist from Rome. So they drew less current, and there was almost no variation in the uniformity of crystal growth along the wafer for MBs. Again, this is interesting because the semiconductor manufacturing, we're talking electromechanical ability to make hardware to make semiconductors. We're still talking about hardware innovation here. So what Japan's market dominance looked like, since we're engaged in a trade war with China at the moment, various origins of that, political and not. So, of course, at the time we didn't know it was a bubble, but this is what was fueling, one of the things that was fueling the trade friction between the US and Japan. The top world market capitalization firms, going from the top, were almost all Japanese companies, 1 through 18, and then here's 19 through 40. So they had steadily gone up. And of course, at the apex of a bubble, nobody knows that it's a bubble. We'll see what happens now. At least there's been some volatility in the US at the end of the year. We might be in a bubble, but still, this was quite shocking. And this was what Japanese strength looked like. So the origins of this, the much studied Japanese model, was of course complementary institutions in the domestic setting. Complementary in the sense that each reinforced the other. Finance was the main bank system. Industrial organization, there are vertical and horizontal business groups. Employment, long-term employment with seniority wages. Government industry ties were dense with interpersonal networks. Bureau pluralism, this is what Masahiko Aoki, the late economist who was here at APARC, and before that at the economics department at Stanford for many years. Competitive export industries were often let alone from the political side. So the politics often followed pork barrel redistribution of wealth. The competitive, in a simplified view, the competitive export-oriented industries created national wealth, which was then redistributed through domestic-facing, relatively non-competitive, but politically strategic industries. So bureau pluralism. The international environment for Japan was basically advantageous. For many years, the US backed access into international markets for Japanese products. At the same time, Japan was allowed to make infant industry protection until it became very competitive. And then by the 1980s, the US firms found that the Japanese market was too competitive in many areas, so they couldn't get in. And the politicized markets were essentially closed, so they couldn't get in. And so the net effect was it looked like an asymmetric relationship. So a lot of the production innovations, lean production, the strength of Japanese firms grew out of the Japanese model. It was very strong. But then 1990, Japan's asset bubble burst. Of course, lots of ink was spilled about how silly it was to expect that asset prices like land would always go up. And of course, 2008, the US had the same model, but a little more sophisticated, bigger damage. 1990s, new dynamics of competition as Silicon Valley became the center of the US innovation system, global value creation. And so we have a bunch of recommended readings on our Silicon Valley New Japan Project website for the Silicon Valley model, how it came about and how the different pieces work. 1990s, rise of the Silicon Valley model. Finance was venture capital. Industry organization was large firm and startup symbiosis and open innovation. So lots of startups would be sold off to large companies who would buy them, that kind of symbiosis, or the startups would go and replace previous generations of large companies. Employment, highly fluid, highly educated, global draw. Government, industry, university organization was highly interactive and multi-directional. The startup ecosystem had a multitude of support actors, right? The law firms screened people. The accounting firms also looked at teams and were paid in stock options. So social factors, entrepreneurs were celebrated, which also means that failures, the monitoring and evaluation of failures was effective. Nobody wants to fail. If you fail in a good way, you have more chances. If you fail in a bad way, it's game over for you. This kind of evaluation where the community acts as a monitoring and evaluation mechanism. So the rise of the Silicon Valley model. New production paradigms transformed how value is created. Wintelism, right? Modular architecture of PCs. Most pieces were commoditized. The highest value added was the operating system and the core chip architecture. Intel and Windows took most of the value from the PC, and the PC was not about who can assemble the best hardware. that's not where the value was. Cross-national production networks, having lost to manufacturers from Japan, designing here and then manufacturing first in Taiwan and then overseas Chinese networks and in China. This kind of thing first was pioneered here as an explicit attempt to find a higher value added strategy against Japanese manufacturing prowess, offshored and outsourced manufacturing, platform-based competition, where network externalities allow multiple third parties to use resources from the platform. The more resources are used by the more third parties there are, and the third parties do their own thing, that enhances the value of the platform, which becomes more and more valuable. And a big shift from electromechanical advantage to software. So the dramatic shift in leadership, if we just look at the same thing, the market cap was 1989, these are the Japanese firms, and then 2018, that shifted very decisively. It's also worth noting the difference in market cap. This also tells us that there's a lot more money in stock markets than there was then, but that also has some bigger macroeconomic reasons behind it. But still, we see a decisive shift here. And of course, it's Silicon Valley companies. Another slide that is not here is the largest cash holding companies. And about 6 out of 10 of them are in Silicon Valley. So unless there's hyperinflation, big piles of cash don't disappear so soon. So even if this is inflated and there's going to be a asset devaluation, the cash, unless there's hyperinflation, is still sitting around here. So the clash of political economic models is really what we're talking about here. The traditional Japanese model was strong. It was very strong and effective. I wanted to illustrate how strong it was by some examples. The Silicon Valley model was partly an outgrowth of Japanese strength. They were adjusting to compete and shifting the sumo ring, so to speak, to different rules. And so, for example, Intel's 1985 performance, financial performance was deeply in the red. It was a crisis. They laid off thousands of people. They withdrew from DRAM because they were outcompeted by Toshiba, NEC, and the Japanese players. But they shifted to microprocessors and the strategy of capturing most of the value from Intel inside. So as a result of this clash of different models, where Silicon Valley shifted to a different model, the normal and default sort of risk mitigating behaviors by Japanese firms created during the strong period actively hinder attempts to harness Silicon Valley, harness as in contributing to and deriving value from the ecosystem. So that's where we start with the worst practices. See, if we start here, it's a very different message, right? It's just, here are the, so I started by talking to media firm Ishin, and there were 10 worst practices, and this became a sort of, what's the right word? Do you call it buzzing if it's going through boardrooms and places of large Japanese companies? I'm not sure buzzing is the right word, but anyway, it was widely circulated. So then I did another list because it's 11 through 20, and then there's another one of CVCs. So we don't have to go through all of these, but basically, and it's originally in Japanese, so there's not a whole article behind this, but opening a Silicon Valley office and posting employees without a specific purpose, setting vague missions such as information collection or searching for strategic partners, lacking an understanding that Japanese firms must take the position of showing their value to potential partners in Silicon Valley. Small startups are small, but they're startups. They're not just small firms that can be pushed around very easily because they'll go elsewhere. And not realizing that Silicon Valley firms will be unwilling to meet large Japanese firms if the Japanese firms lack decision-making authority or locally controlled resources. Basically, we have had waves and waves of large company research divisions going and then listing up 250 startups or 500 startups and then going visiting one at a time, and they make nice reports. Their job is to give the report to headquarters. The startups are possibly interested in, well, could we work together? And no, the mission is just information gathering. Once, say a few years ago, the most extreme example was in fintech. Once about 45 firms within the span of 3 months came to a fintech firm. They said, we're not going to meet any more Japanese companies, which is too bad because the 46th one might have actually been ready to do something. So this is community damage that happens. And then running into difficulty with negotiating with startups or even making appointments. The Silicon Valley office ends up doing small chores for headquarters. They're like, you can't get appointments, you can't talk to, well, you're kind of useless. Well, then go look for what I'm looking for right here, which tends to be a half a step away from what's being done now. And if it's just half a step away from what's being done now, that's not likely to disrupt the industry. And part of the story of Silicon Valley's strength is disruptions to entire industries, such as the Japanese wonderful cell phone industry, the Galapagos phones. They were great. They led the world. They were leaders for at least 10 years, but there were no followers. And then they got disrupted. This has happened many times. So the point is then the superiors from headquarters are wondering why the people posted here can't actually even get appointments. So they say, okay, well, I'll go check it out. Book some meetings with some interesting startups. And so the local office becomes a travel agency, taking care of visitors from Japan. And then once you meet them and then there's no business development, you can't make it again. You can't meet them again, so you have to figure out new connections. And then other things are the headquarters sometimes can't process cutting edge developments because it doesn't fit the existing worldview. For example, in 2012, some very interesting local Japanese workers at large companies sent reports saying there's this thing called Bitcoin. The underlying thing is called blockchain, and this paradigm might be a game changer. And nobody understood what they're talking about. And then 2016 or so, everybody said, bro, blockchain, oh, that sounds interesting. Well, why didn't you tell us about this? And so, okay, fine. And then when they were very interested in blockchain, the people who are cutting edge are saying, no, it's not going to happen. But everybody else is doing it. I don't think so. And then, yeah, so anyway. And then personnel rotations in headquarters is sometimes moves the champion of the Silicon Valley strategy elsewhere in the company. So then the whole mission becomes adrift. And sending employees to Silicon Valley, sometimes they're too inexperienced. The top management says, and I can circulate these too, but Silicon Valley is for young people. Look at Mark Zuckerberg. But actually the average age of entrepreneurs here is age 39 to 41, so it's not that young. And so then they send people who are too young, and so they don't know what their own company does, and they don't know the right people within the company or have experience. Others, well, this has decreased in the latest cycle, but the people who come here and they're already depressed and you're wondering what's going on, and it's because they were on track to manage and go to become a star, but then they did something that didn't work out, and then they had to get sent here, which was not a promotion. Another is that the standard 3-year employee rotation system, which served Japanese companies very well, because how else are you going to flexibly deploy workers with very short notice into different places? But for Silicon Valley, it really doesn't work, because the first year you make the networks, it's difficult to figure out how to live here, cook for yourself, etc. And then second year, you can go do projects, and then by the third year, you don't have a long time horizon. Your time horizon becomes shorter and shorter. So you want to do a project, but if it's not done in 3 months because you only have 3 months left, then you can't actually pass it to your next person. So I've seen this at networking parties where a Japanese, very well-meaning employee is there, and then there's a local person from here, and they say, oh, nice to meet you, what do you do? I'm from so-and-so, what do you do? And then, oh, so how long have you been here? Oh, about 2.5 years. And then the person from here freezes and says, so are you going back in April? And I say, yeah, I'm actually going back in April. And they say, excuse me, and then they walk away. So this is too bad. So the whole point of the strength, one of the strengths of Japanese companies is that big chunks of the company are not laid off at regular or irregular intervals. And so why, for having a long view potential from the employee system, because what often happens to Silicon Valley startups here working with large companies is they're close to a deal, and then one day the emails bounce back and they don't know what's going on. Well, the whole division just got fired. The whole project got shut down. Nobody told anybody of it. So you're left here as a startup with the counterparty risk that your counterpart in, let's say, Cisco or somewhere just disappeared. And you have no way of knowing who was who, and everybody dispersed. That doesn't happen with Japanese companies. That being said, even though it doesn't happen, not being able to use longer time horizons is a waste, because a lot of the relationships here are multiple iterations from one startup to another startup, and they're often very personal. And this will lead to some of the experiences of the Japanese companies. Here are the cases that we'll talk about. The second 10, we're going to go faster here. Basically, if you're going to introduce your company, right, if you're talking to startups here, if they've received funding, usually are pretty good about saying, here's the pain point. that I'm solving. It's a very deep pain point. I can measure it. Here's my solution. I invented something. Or here's the approach we're doing. Here's the solution to the pain point. And here's how it scales, right? If you're, my favorite joke, especially to Japanese audiences who come in, I give a lot of talks, is there's a nice joke in Silicon Valley that scale is everything, right? If you want to make yourself sound like the smartest person in the room, no matter what anybody says, just pretend that you think about it and then say, that's interesting, but does it scale? Right? And try it. It's great. I have a new idea, but does it scale? I have a new invention, but does it scale? Right? Very effective. And so I have a new analysis about this. Does it scale? I have a nice presentation, but does it? So anyway, the point there is they're used to doing this, but the standard way of good manners, Japanese large company gentleman's introduction is to have a PowerPoint that has many pages with 250 figures and about 3,000 arrows in it with very small font, and to explain, starting with, our company was founded in 1912 by so-and-so, and we have 8 business areas, and these are the relative sizes of them, and here are the, and so often we have the very patiently explaining person on the one hand, and the very fidgety local entrepreneur who just can't handle this, and then they're trying to figure out what's happening here. It's just a simple culture clash, and so one of the things that I've seen is that some Japanese companies who are posted here, the local employees, they're not necessarily free to make their own PowerPoint slides to explain their company, saying, here is our pain point. We are good at making X, Y, Z, but value is shifting here. Now, I would like to work with you to provide you with these things because you seem to be adding this kind of value. We can add that value to your vision using our resources, and you can contribute this. Let's scale this together. But this doesn't go through, if it goes through the proper channels at headquarters, it usually doesn't go through. So the people here have to make their own sort of secret slides, and then when they go home, maybe these are shredded because the next employee who comes here and I talk to them, it's back to the same starting point, and they make another one. This is wasted effort. So initially, the inability to escape the Japanese style explaining oneself and one's company, this is actually a pretty big hurdle. And of course, you can have support at the top. The president of the company comes, upper management comes, they love it here. They say, oh, this is great, let's do something. And the people here said, yeah, that's what we're trying to do. And then everything that they throw to headquarters or the business groups dies somewhere in between, because it's not going to help the revenue immediately to have, let's say, a not so well manufactured LiDAR sensor that may not be useful for the car that needs to come out in 2 years from a small company here. But maybe that's not the point. So the sort of ambidextrous organization thoughts of what's your sort of your main hand and then your not dominant hand. If it falls into the dominant hand style, then it's very difficult to evaluate things that don't follow that. So I call it the Othello game, but basically, if the top wants to do something and the bottom wants to do something, ideally you can flip the players in between, and that's very difficult. And Silicon Valley strategies can be reversed. It's also difficult to evaluate people who are from here. Of course, people cost a lot, but not all people who cost a lot are very good, or the culture doesn't fit. So that's difficult to evaluate. And yeah, again, small, medium businesses and startups can be very different animals. So very fast-moving startup. The idea, I think Reid Hoffman was one of the people who popularized this, who made LinkedIn. But right, you jump off from a cliff and you need to invent something that will fly and then take flight before you land on the ground. That's how the startups are moving here, which is very different from small, medium businesses, which are trying to survive. They wouldn't want to take those kinds of risks. And they're different from suppliers of large firms. So they're working with different types of companies. And of course, M&A can be a goal, but it is probably not a good goal in of itself. It's a mechanism to do something. So you can buy companies because you have cash, but what are you going to do once you buy it? It's different buying a mature business versus a startup, a high-growth startup. There's what I call a direct translation was we can make it in-house syndrome, where a startup is doing something interesting and you bring it to the R&D labs and say, oh, we can do that too. Yes, but it'll take you 3 years. This is almost ready. So maybe you can do things that you can do and not veto some of the interesting things that are coming out of here. And top management sometimes really doesn't understand software paradigm or how different value can be created. So most people, including non-Japanese companies, really didn't see that smartphones would have the disruptive effect that they did on a variety of industries, say communications equipment, handsets, say software, apps, right? Microsoft misread this. There's a wonderful quote by Steve Ballmer, former CEO, saying, well, the iPhone, well, it's $500. That's the most expensive mobile phone I've ever heard of. There's no keyboard. It's not good for business. It'll be absolutely impossible for them to get any significant market share. And of course, the Windows Phone market share is now 0%, and Apple's doing quite fine, and Android too. And so basically, these things are hard to evaluate. But this is especially the case if you're not familiar with the actual technology. So then CVCs, but we don't have to go through this, worst practices. Of the various forms of engagement, Japanese companies tend to either make offices here, become limited partners to venture capital companies here, or make their own corporate venture capital. And this is in making their own corporate venture capital. There are several landmines that, again, if you don't know about these things, they're easy to step. Because let's say $100 million seems to be the standard size of a CVC, but really, what's the purpose? Is it financial or is it strategic? Well, what's strategic? And then often we sometimes see CVC teams or say, well, we have investment professionals. Yes, but those are private equity people or they're investment bankers that may not have anything to do really with the venture capital community here. But it's not obvious if you don't understand the venture capital world to see whether these people are possibly useful in there or not. And yeah, again, employee rotation. Some manufacturers will say, well, we don't play money games. That's also a code word for we got burned in the Japanese assets by buying land and things in the 80s. But we're not aimed at just making money from investments. We want to do strategic returns, so we don't want financial returns. But then, of course, it's difficult because the venture capital view is, well, if you invest in a company that goes bust, that's not a really good investment anyway, is it? So you probably do need financial return if you're thinking of a strategic return, because investing something in something that goes bust is not strategic anyway. So how to align these various things. And of course, often the best opportunities are the ones that won't let you invest in them. And this is, again, a different perspective if you're used to being a big company. Needing approval for headquarters, how much local autonomy do you have? I've seen some companies say, yes, we're very risk averse. We're very, to reduce the risk, we make sure that we do very good due diligence from headquarters and that the business groups have full support before investing something. Yes, that's fine, so that if they invest in something, the business groups will be able to do something with it. So how long does the process take to invest? About 4 months. Well, this doesn't work. And so often you need to be moving faster. And again, it's easy to make an accelerator and call it an accelerator, which is basically a room with some people in it and not really connected to anything. But it can look good if you say, we're going to make an accelerator. And these days, especially in Tokyo, there are too many accelerators. And it's partly the easiest thing to do. So how does that relate to a CVC? Isn't there a selection bias where if you make an accelerator that has no track record, but you have a CVC, aren't the ones that are going to go to a non-known accelerator the ones that have no other options? Aren't the ones that you really want in your accelerator the ones that are not going to come to your accelerator? So how do you bridge that? So there's this kind of thing. And this shouldn't be news, but unfortunately it is. And I say, oh, I didn't. And so, and again, a disconnect between the CVC branch and core business units. The CVC says, let's do this. The core business unit says, I'm not interested in the least. So then the CVC, well, what is it for again? And then I get quite worried about this because there have been several waves of big Japanese companies doing various investing, not just making offices, but investing. They come as the peak is near the peak, and then as soon as Silicon Valley enters a downturn, they leave. But that's sort of buying high and selling low. And since the core business of Japanese companies are not determined by their performance in Silicon Valley, right when there's a downturn here should be the best time to move in aggressively. So this concerns me, and I want to get this out before others, before the next downturn comes. So then, here's the antidote to the worst practices. This is a Silicon Valley New Japan Summit that we've done. We started in 2016. We did one in 2017 and 18. And then we've had Tokyo ones in the summers of 2017 and 18. So lessons derived from various fireside keynotes and panels. Much of the content is available on an excellent media series, free articles published by Ishin. They're in Japanese, so here are the English ones. The interpretations of these panels are my interpretations, so I might have made some mistakes. These cases are not official, so if this makes it back to headquarters, these are not the employees' faults if I say things that are misrepresenting what they're doing, so the errors are my own. Komatsu. This is one of my absolute favorite companies, and it should be yours too. So Komatsu Silicon Valley Strategies. They're a construction equipment company, and they're transforming agriculture and seeking remotely controlled construction equipment. I didn't know that Effect was doing. Good job, research assistant. So Komatsu, first the background. This is a bit of a repeat, but then it gets interesting. So they were the first manufacturer in the world to commercialize autonomous haulage systems, right? We're trying to do autonomous driving here. They've had these big trucks driving, but of course, I mean, it's a tough environment, but it's a closed environment. There aren't many pedestrians there, and good luck if there are animals, but there aren't too many there, unfortunately. So anyway, they've been doing that since 2008. And the way they think about value, because what's the value you're doing? It's not about, hey, we can make this automated because we're just going to save labor, because in a big mining operation, labor costs are significant, but they're not that significant in the operation. It's the other areas, like the tires. These big tires cost very large sums. They needed to be replaced every 12 months or so with people driving them. Once the AHS, autonomous driving, hit, they actually lasted 16 to 18 months, which means the operators of the mines have to buy far fewer tires. It saves them a lot of cost. And I guess the reason is that you've been driving these in 50 degrees Celsius heat and for 8 hours. And if you do even a little bit of a jerky movement, the damage to the tires is much more than the cars that we drive. So having it completely automated actually makes it much easier on the tires. And this next version prototype that's out here, I think they're almost ready to commercialize it, building the human components for the cab and stuff. Well, you don't need that if it's autonomous. It's just basically the, whatever you call this part, and some wheels. And they're also able to do things like, if you're backing up next to a cliff where the huge digger is putting lots of dirt into this 5-story house-sized truck, you go close to a cliff, it's pretty scary. So if a person is driving it, they don't back up right to the cliff's edge. And so the chairman was describing how he often, when he visited these places, the operators of the digger and the truck would be having an argument at the canteen later, saying, hey, you got to back up more because I have to do more moves. And I say, no, I'm not. And they almost come to blows. But if it's fully automated, it goes much closer. So they noticed that even things like scooping motions can be saved. So their idea for value is to reduce the costs of their customers by automating something. So that's an important perspective of what's the value. And we know about Comtrex since 2001. It's a vertically integrated IT system. It alerts the customers of wear and tear on parts that require maintenance or replacement. I recently saw an interesting article in one of the Silicon, it was maybe TechCrunch or one of those, saying, yeah, pretty soon your car is going to tell you that your parts are going to wear out and whatnot. The future is almost here. It's been here for close to 20 years in places like Komatsu's Comtrex. So utilize machine usage data, right? They didn't trust the data coming out of, say, China, localities where things were booming, but the machines were not being used that much. So they actually didn't build up so much inventory because according to the economic data, there was about to still be a boom, but the machine's utilization wasn't so high. So they figured that they wouldn't be selling a lot, and true enough, they didn't. And there was a big difference between Caterpillar and Komatsu, and they can stop operation of leased machines if the payments don't come in. And a few other things they realized is, hey, your machine hasn't been used, but the fuel has decreased. I think somebody's siphoning your fuel. Or, by the way, did you notice that all your machines, they're running during lunch break with the engine on and the air conditioning in the cab on? You're in a very hot place. And as an air conditioning unit, this is very inefficient to run this as an air conditioner. Why don't you make a little rest house for your workers to have lunch in that's air conditioned? And sure enough, that's what they needed. So they were able to save quite a bit on fuel cost. This is the operators. So again, creating value for the operators. And they've pioneered and equipped this very important paradigm of AI. And this is the basis of what we talk a lot about in our policy discussions. Is AI going to remove a lot of jobs, or is it going to create some jobs? Well, first of all, we need to talk about two branches of AI. There's AI that replaces people, and there's IA, intelligence augmentation, that takes low-skilled people and enables them to do high-skilled jobs. And Komatsu has done this, where it can be your first day after getting a license for one of these diggers. And if your job is to dig an angle, it's very difficult to use this 3 or 4 points that you have looking this way, operating like this to make a diagonal cut. And if you make a mistake, it's very costly. You can't just sort of say, oh, let's put the dirt back in and then make a big building. It doesn't work like that. So you have to recalculate, you have to recut. It takes about 10 years of experience to be able to do this. Komatsu's new systems allow you to do it with no year's experience, basically. You just bring the machine close and it does it. But the machine doesn't have to be fully automated. If there's a big shadow here and the machine doesn't know if this is a plastic bag or a big rock, well, the operator can say, oh, that's a plastic bag, or that looks like a big rock. If they're not sure, they just get out of the machine, run over there and check it out. So as a paradigm, AI can remove a lot of jobs. And at the same time, are the jobs being lost along with the person, or does it just free up the person to do other activities? At the same time, IA allows people with low skills to be able to do formerly highly skilled jobs. So there are a lot of McKinsey and other reports out there that have very specific, and some academic studies too. There's a couple folks from Oxford. I've met one of them. He's kind of a pessimistic person. Basically, very specific numbers of how many jobs will disappear. But we also need to augment that with the number of jobs that can be upskilled. Komatsu's done that. Komatsu and smart construction, this is where it becomes more Silicon Valley. They met Skycatch, the San Francisco company, in 2014, November. They signed a contract in the next month, and they announced it the following month. They did a test showing it to top management, and within 7 months, they used drones all over construction sites to make 3D maps of their construction sites. This was very fast. And we did a panel 2 years ago with Skycatch, the San Francisco drone company, and Komatsu. And Skycatch was saying, yeah, we met them, and when they said that they're going to work with us, they told us to prepare because they would move faster than the startup. And it's true, they moved really, really fast once they committed. And this has, they went around many of the problems of, say, people at the working level here versus the top leadership not being connected. Well, they were connected. And so they rolled out their full smart construction, and they've deployed this all over Japan now, and there are a bunch of competitors at this point. Now, smart agriculture, this was another interesting thing they did. So bulldozer. So we think of rice paddies where there's rice. And if you think about, again, value, what's the most costly part of a rice field? The most costly part is transplanting rice from the seedlings about this high into the rice paddies. That's why people have bent backs, right? They did this, and then now they're Yanmar and et cetera, have very specialized machines that are very small. It doesn't scale, that transplant the young rice in there. That's very costly. Why do they do that? And Komatsu went in. It's sort of like design thinking, but they did it organically. So that's the highest cost. Why do people transplant the rice? Well, the answer is that it turns out to be that the bottom of rice paddies that have water in them are not flat. Because they're not flat, if you just put the seed in there, it will come out crooked, or the seed will get washed away, or a bird will eat it, and the yield is not high. So what if they can make it completely flat? Well, Komatsu's ICT bulldozers can make land completely flat, plus or minus 5 millimeters. So they did a bunch of experiments in Ishikawa Prefecture, where Komatsu City is, where the company started, and they basically made completely flat rice paddies and then put water in them, and then found that the yield rates from just planting from the seed rice was something like 50% higher yield, and so 40% less cost. And so then they took it a step further and said, well, actually a rice field doesn't always have to be a rice field. It can be a barley field, it can have soba, it can be other things depending on the market prices. Basically, a rice paddy, the land is an asset that can be redeployed into different places. It's an industrial way of thinking applied to a very traditional non-mechanized, mechanized in this way, sort of industrial production paradigm, and they've been doing this. So the Silicon Valley part of this was first they did it with the bulldozers, and it turns out that bulldozers in rice paddies work really well, and that bulldozers have a frame. They're made for tougher construction conditions. They are cheaper and they last longer than agricultural tractors, the smaller ones in Japan anyway. And they want to do this in Indonesia and other places because that's where there's a lot of efficiency gains to be had. So now they're using wheel loaders, these things. It's sort of like bigger bulldozers and with wheels. Now, they just did last December several tests using 2 startups from Silicon Valley and one from San Francisco. These wheel loaders have a joint in the middle. So I don't know if you have little kids like I do, they play with the Tomica ones of these ones. But basically, because there's a joint in the middle, if you're going to try to make it fully autonomous, then you have to go slowly. It doesn't stabilize because the joint is in the middle. If you go faster, it'll be stable. So it's a very difficult technical problem to try to make these to go autonomously. So they partnered with one firm, Swift Navigation, that makes GPS positioning technology at a very high resolution for device guidance. AG Junction develops the hardware and software applications for various things in agriculture. So basically the attachments, and not in this picture is one of these agricultural attachments on the back of this wheel loader. And Novariant, which is over in Fremont, it provides GPS and machine control solutions. So it provided sort of the being able to go in a straight line combined with very high precision GPS. So they were basically working with these 3 companies that thought that it would be very interesting if they could get their systems deployed by Komatsu to have autonomous wheel loader construction equipment in agriculture where major productivity gains could be had. And Komatsu has a global footprint. These startups did not know each other until they started working with Komatsu. So one of the functions that a big Japanese company can provide is first global reach, because they do various things around the world. And second, big companies like Komatsu, agriculture is not their core activity, but it's a new area that they can move into using their core competence, which is very exciting for startups to be able to challenge with new value creation areas using their core things. And a third was, since they didn't know each other until they worked with Komatsu, the Japanese companies can actually provide a platform for otherwise complementary, because for Swift Navigation, they actually previously made the automated landing gear for United Airlines. So Swift Navigation and Novariant, they're very complementary. And so through working with Komatsu, they met each other. And other things they do, forestry machines in Sweden, these big machines. Sweden has enough trees, apparently, that there's still more trees than you can cut, and they plant new trees. So, because it sounds kind of deforestation scary, but at the same time, they work with NVIDIA and others. Basically, these things, it goes in and cuts the tree and then strips the bark. When it strips the bark, it measures the circumference of the tree, and then it communicates with the market to figure out what the length for the logs should be. What's the highest price? It communicates it to the market, and then so it just cuts it, strips it, and then communicates, and then goes bam, 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 and then makes logs, and then done. And so, but what the operator needed to do until recently was identify what kind of tree it is. But now they're using machine learning to be able to identify what tree it is. So the machine identifies what kind of tree it is. And there's another slide that I don't have that. It can be kind of tricky. One tree can look like another tree. And so it's a fairly high skill thing to be able to do that. And if you get the wrong tree, it's a different market price. So, and they're going, I mean, this does sound horrifying, but apparently the numbers in Sweden work out. A fill rate of 3 trees per minute is what they're trying to aim for this. And what they've been doing is they're an LP of Draper, Nexus, and Core Ventures. They don't have a core office in Silicon Valley. They do have visiting researchers. One was at Stanford CARS, the autonomous one, and then UC Berkeley, and one is in deep learning. And the CTO office manager, Mr. Togashi, he frequently travels between Japan and Silicon Valley, and he actually goes round and round the world. His favorite ticket is the around the world ticket. Of course, there's scalability of the strategy. I keep meeting him. He's full of energy. He's often brought subordinates who look really tired, and the next trip he makes, the subordinate isn't there. So he might be burning out people. So, but he's able to meet face to face with startups. He's very, very close to the CTO. The CTO in Komatsu is all about doing strategic investments. So even if the company's budget overall decreases, the CTO's budget increases. The CTO is very close to the president and chairman. And so this line of leadership is very strong. They trust each other and they know each other very well. So it gets rid of a lot of the big company problems. And they believe that they can move fast. So they have very good information flows. And one of the things that they did was they created Landlog, a company that's an open platform for construction sites. They just made an office over here in the valley. The idea is to make an open platform for construction sites so that any machinery can connect to any other machinery. But unlike GE's Predict system that GE used to be peddling until bad things happened to GE, they don't want to just take the data, optimize it, and give it back. They're happy to make it an open platform because the way they think about it, the more devices are connected in a construction site, the more efficient everything becomes. And Komatsu, of course, will have their machines connect to it. And as we suffer for, I don't understand how it takes 8 months to put grass over here, but that kind of thing sounds like a great idea. Or like the building over there where I'm sure there were some safety issues because there was a ladder and it was shaky. Anyway, so Landlog is an open platform. And so the idea, and they're working with SAP, Optim, and Dogo, and they're happy to get their rivals in. I don't know about Caterpillar, but they want John Deere and others to be part of this as well because they want it as an open platform. Now that kind of open platform is something that I've never heard any other Japanese company talk about making, where it might not even be a Komatsu brand, but they're going to pay for it because they want to move forward smart construction sites. And this was a product, they say it's a product of their International Advisory Board meetings. Every 2 years, they bring their chairman, president, CTO, executives, and head of US subsidiaries all right here to Silicon Valley. And they all look at and talk through various technology issues. For example, this past October, they went and talked about, well, what does an industrial application of blockchain really look like for our uses? Do we really need it? How can it be useful? Really, not just the hype. Let's talk through this. Or when they're working on demonstration projects, they go in and the chairman and president will go in and look at the projects and see how it's going. And so there's a very strong understanding of where they're headed. And some things they'll say, let's accelerate this. Others they'll say, I don't know why we're doing it this way, things like that. And so the idea of Landlog here is, right, their open API of various equipment that then goes into the Landlog data, which also has an open API, and people can make various things on top of it. So a next step that they're doing that I find fascinating is haptics and human-machine interface. We've all seen VR being peddled around as one of the next big things. This never made sense to me. I thought maybe it was just a generation thing, but actually, if you think about it, we need complementary other technologies to make it really work. For example, if you have a VR and you want to work and use a piece of heavy machinery, it's not just sound, you need tactile feedback, so the haptics. And they've got underway some very interesting things with cutting-edge researchers, researcher, entrepreneur, medical doctor on prosthetics, because the people making prosthetics understand haptics the best, how people's nerves interact with machines. And they have video clips to share clear visions of their future, which can provide a focal point for where they want to head. So one of their latest videos shows a construction site somewhere. Some of the machines are fully autonomous. A few need people. And one person is there, but they need another one, and they need to source a person. And they say, well, is anybody available? And it's a US construction site, but they source it, and there's somebody in New Zealand who says, oh, I'm ready. I can take this one. And he puts on his goggles, and then his joysticks and the haptics and the feedback is realistic as though he's right there. So clearly, we've got this part, and especially the VR, if it moves forward just a little bit more, the processing power will be there to be very realistic. But without the tactile feedback or the sound coming not just from speakers, but the entire screen maybe emitting. Sony was making one of these. The screen emits the sound, something like that. So it's not just VR per se, but complementary technologies, when they're ready, then uses of this can move forward. And they have a clear vision and they want to move forward with it. So they're talking to a bunch of people they won't tell us about yet to develop this. They're very focused on construction equipment. But this is another interesting part of the Japanese company model. Often, if they're very focused on one thing, they can have breakthroughs that have wide applications elsewhere. So that was Komatsu. The others are a little shorter. Panasonic, so Mr. Kinoshita, when he gave his talk here, he went through and had the worst practices and pointed out that they had done a lot of them, and then they pointed out how they were moving forward from them. 1998, Panasonic arrived in a booming Silicon Valley. Their goal was to find new technologies and businesses to help Panasonic with new product development and to do investing. They made about 40 investments and reasonable performance, 4 IPOs and 10 M&A. But by 2007, so the way Mr. Kinoshita said, the first years were good. But by 2007, the company was falling behind in Silicon Valley. Their main business in Japan, many of you followed this, they followed the hype of 3D televisions, and they made big factory investments for, was it LCD panels or was it the other one? Yeah, the competing technology. Well, anyway, display. Yeah, plasma. There we go. Yeah, plasma. And this didn't work out. And so they were, the company was in dire straits to a bit. And part of what they realized was that the headquarters required input for each investment. So the good targets were snatched up by faster VCs that were local. And over time, and partly because their strategy had been 3D TV, which then failed, they then ran out of sort of strategic capacity to figure out what they were trying to do in Silicon Valley. And so they had a vision to acquire some companies, but beyond that, they were sort of adrift, is how Mr. Kinoshita said. But in 2015, they shifted strategy. They thought about this carefully. They wanted broader investment targets. They wanted to focus on a financial return, making investment into good startups, even if it wasn't immediately what the business groups needed that moment. Longer term, and efforts to analyze and anticipate changing trends, and by engaging with a lot of startups to be able to analyze that. So in April 2017, they created the Panasonic Venture Silicon Valley office, and then they made a CVC fund of about 100 million US dollars. And within a year and a half or so, they invested in about 18 companies, about 30 million yen. So how they set up this CVC was Conductive Ventures, which is not Panasonic branded, but they got a couple folks from, were the managing directors, Kerry Lai and Paul Ye. They were at Intel Capital and Kleiner Perkins before creating Conductive Ventures. And Panasonic is the general partner for Conductive. So it's basically a CVC. Now, they may go raise others from other LPs for future funds, but the first one is basically Panasonic. And some of the things that Mr. Kinoshita-san was saying after they came on board was that the networks that they had, interpersonal networks, to be able to tap into deal flow, led to companies coming and pitching to them of a quality that he had never seen before. Before, when he was doing it from Panasonic on his own, there were various companies, and he invested in some of them, and some of them he got duped a little bit, where, for example, one was saying that, yeah, they did a proof of concept, and they were working with one of the big Silicon Valley startups. But it turned out that instead of actually working with them in a very serious way, it was literally just a proof of concept, and the proof of concept was done, and then that was it. So, but he didn't realize that such things could happen because surely the other company would say something if they were being used for that kind of fundraising purposes. And it turns out the technology didn't work very well. So the type of due diligence that Kerry and Paul were doing, and the kinds of people they would bring in, this was very eye-opening. And the team is consisting of the local employee here, that was Kinoshita-san, and another person, and then the two of them. And they decide here. They don't have to go to headquarters to have approval to make the investments. So they were able to move quite quickly and invest in several different places. And of course, the difference between just throwing the money to somebody else and then having them just invest for financial returns is the point of the Panasonic people in there is to be able to see if certain things look like they'd be of interest to the business groups. They go to the business groups and make that interface. So they don't expect the venture capitalists to go and try to figure out what the business units want in the Panasonic various divisions itself. And we also did a panel, Fujifilm, Itochu, and Rakuten, different ways of trying to harness Silicon Valley. Itochu, I didn't know this, but apparently they have been here a long time. They were established in 1990, and surprisingly, to me at least, they had invested in over 45 US VC funds. They've been all over the place, 3,000 companies through that, and then they initiated several successful business collaborations. Historically, most of their success has been bringing many of the major Silicon Valley companies to Japan. And so we had known some of these, but they have been very quiet about this kind of activity. And I asked, so which VC funds? And they said, well, sorry, we're not at, and which companies? And I said, sorry, we can't tell you. And then they're scratching their heads why the, this is all in good fun, but and then they're wondering why they're not more well known. And I was saying, well, you got to tell us what you're doing. So, so they now have a new strategic management plan focused on technological innovation and changing workplace values and environment. So apparently, again, they won't tell us who exactly they're investing in and what kinds of places they're invested, they're targeting. But apparently, they're moving to have a much heavier focus on Silicon Valley. And this is the first step of there's various internal political dynamics, of course, but they're becoming more of an ecosystem player here to try to say, hey, we're actually been here and we do significant things. Fujifilm. So they have several what they call the Global Innovation Hub networks in Tokyo, Silicon Valley, and the Netherlands. And they made their Silicon Valley Open Innovation Hub in 2015. And the first part reads like the usual thing. They generate leads, initiate projects to create new business areas, generate financial returns, but they've been moving fairly quickly. They engaged with 600 companies and got 20 companies projects initiated. One of their focuses that it's a little different from others is they're very focused on bringing some of the R&D creations that they had to Silicon Valley and figure out who here can benefit from them. Because their budgets, yearly budgets for R&D were mind-bogglingly large in terms of if we think about, say, how much funding does a unicorn have, et cetera. And of course, their research is in various different areas. So, but the overall budget is truly large. So they're actually very good at doing a bunch of other things. But the question is, how do you make the interpersonal connections in Silicon Valley to be able to figure out what people want? Because often the pain point of a fast-growing Silicon Valley startup that's starting to do something regarding hardware or something that needs precision manufacturing is they don't know exactly where to procure that. And the Japanese company doesn't know who needs what they happen to be good at. So they're trying to figure out, again, how to scale this. But the orientation is actually to, and this is, yeah, I mean, often the idea is to try to absorb from here some new technology or something, and they're actually consciously trying to do the opposite too. And Rakuten US has been pretty dramatic in what they've been doing here, their expansion. They started in 2005 acquiring Linkshare, and they made that into Rakuten Marketing. 2010, they acquired Buy.com in Rakuten USA. And then they experienced a lot of difficulty making this into sort of, well, Buy.com is not wasn't one of the biggest winners. And so not buying the winner then lets you learn a lot about what you require to do e-commerce here. But then they went and bought a bunch of other things. Ebates for $1 billion, Kobo, Viki, Overdrive. These are all after 2011. Sorry, the dates dropped off. And they've been doing various investments. They were an early investor in Lyft, Cabify, Areem, WePay, Folio. So within Japan, their Rakuten shop and travel agency are some of their core businesses. But here, their strategy is to take the revenue from what they have in the Japanese market and then put it into a portfolio of different companies here. They're not trying to take their core competence in Japan over here. And in terms of, so acquisitions, and those are the ones, major investments. And they have an office in San Mateo. It's very near the airport, quite convenient. They get information, they feed it. They have 4 CVC funds. One is in fintech and some in different areas, and they cover global. And the CEO, Mr. Mikitani, he visits regularly in his plane, and he has a house in Atherton, and he regularly gathers people here, various Silicon Valley people, to do deals. And so the idea of how well is the top leadership engaged? Well, very engaged. They also just started a co-working space in their Silicon Valley office that's close to the airport, and they're trying to get slightly, and the way their floors are laid out, they have companies that they acquired in different areas in an open floor plan. So what do you do with the company after you acquire it? What do you do with the culture? They have the core of Rakuten culture, but they're bringing others into the same floor space. And so it's an experiment, but they're quite committed to this. And then Obayashi Corporation. This was a keynote, and it was very interesting because this was the first time they publicized their strategy in Silicon Valley. They actually, Obayashi, the traditional construction side, they've been here for some time. Their first contract in the US was in 1979 in San Francisco. They've done major projects like the Golden Gate Bridge seismic retrofit, and of course the now infamous, but I don't think it's their fault, San Francisco Transbay Transit Center. Beautiful, but had some problems. Despite a long history in the Bay Area, Obayashi really wasn't a Silicon Valley insider. They were a construction company. They had bought a local company, and they were doing construction projects. So, and the internal company culture was one where it wasn't obvious that they would be working with outsiders and coordinating with outside firms. Another one, and this is classic, there weren't any really IT people on the Obayashi technology team because they didn't need IT in the way that Silicon Valley thinks about IT, IoT, and things like this. And they didn't really have a strategy on what are we going to do in Silicon Valley. We happen to be here, and now it seems like it's going to transform a lot of things because measuring with cheap sensors, all of this. And so what they created was the Silicon Valley Ventures and Laboratory. And Mr. Sato was mentored by various people who have made offices, say, for example, this sounds a lot like the Yamaha one. And he had been mentored by Saijo-san from Yamaha, who I talked about in the previous talk. And so they have several strategies here. But what I found was, and what he's appealing is one of the most interesting things, they basically have a warehouse that's a mock-up of a construction site in San Carlos. And they invite startups to go and work with them in the construction site and warehouse. And because they have a construction company subsidiary here in the Bay Area, if the startup can get itself into Obayashi's network, then they could be deployed commercially in real-world applications here in the Bay Area, not just in Japan. Japan is a huge market, but it still is far away. So what they did was Obayashi Challenge. It's the second year they've done it. It's an annual seed selection event, and they invited about 20 startups to come do things that required the use of its construction site warehouse. For example, measuring things using augmented reality, or taking time-lapse photos, because basically often when you finish making something and something's out of place, you have to go back and figure out when it started to diverge from the blueprint. Well, if you keep taking images over time, you can tell when it started to diverge. Then of course you can take the next step. Whenever you do something and it diverges from the blueprint, it can tell you immediately, so you don't have to go back and make it. And a lot of Silicon Valley startups now are going into this space of augmented reality, measuring things, cheap sensors, clever ways to measure things, and then making it into lots of data. So what they did was quite clever. They brought the team from Japan that was able to choose which startups to continue to work with. They brought 20 startups. They did the Obayashi Challenge pitch contest on the first day. And that night, the Japanese people from Japan had to go call and get approval so that, and that was the first day of a week-long stay, so that the rest of the week was devoted to follow-up meetings and whatnot with the 5 or 6 teams selected. Usually what happens is there's an event maybe at the culmination of a trip, and then they'll say, okay, we'll bring it back to headquarters and think about it. And then on the flight to Narita or Haneda or wherever, the flood of emails comes of stuff you haven't done, and then they get busy, and then nothing happens. The follow-up doesn't happen. This was to bring people who had resources and make a decision in the beginning, and then just basically trap them here for a week where they had to follow up with the ones they chose. And the first year, it was a new trial, and it worked very well, apparently. And so they did it again this past year. So, and yeah, and that's sort of what it looked like. Nomura Innovation in Silicon Valley. Nomura Securities. They're based in the US operations are in New York, of course. They established an office here, mainly for collecting information, and they have a, again, 100 million CVC fund. They also are trying out a new product, which is a venture debt service. It's basically debt to startups who don't want to give up equity. It's gone full circle in some cases where people are concerned about having to give so much equity to various startups, and then you have to sell yourself off even if you're not ready to. So they think that there's actually full circle another market for debt here. And of course, bridging between startups here and Japan. And they also became an LP of the Dreamers Fund, which was an unlikely collaboration. I didn't know they knew each other, but of Keisuke Honda, the soccer player, and Will Smith. So Will Smith's family office actually turns out to be an experienced investor in various Silicon Valley startups at a pretty early stage, such as Uber, Lending Club, Spotify, SpaceX, Ripple. I had no idea. And I still don't know where they met, but they're part of the Will Smith family circle. There's a Japanese fellow who was raised mostly here, and he's friends with the Nomura people, and they are finding that the star power opens doors. So they got Keisuke Honda on board, and they're going to try something a little different. Who knows if it'll work out or not, but of course, but we can all agree this is different. We've never seen this pattern before. Source Next. This is also different and very exciting. The perspective of a listed Japanese company CEO whose CEO is, for a long time, the main person living in Silicon Valley. So that's Matsuda-san there. So in September 2012, Mr. Matsuda, who's the CEO, co-founder, and president of Source Next, he moved to Silicon Valley with 3 aims. There was no Silicon Valley office for his company. He just moved here with his family. He also was co-founder, and his wife was vice president, so this helped too. Gather good content. His original business model was to take lots of Silicon Valley software and sell it in Japan. So he had great success with Evernote, for example. Evernote is something to be downloaded, except in Japan you can buy it at the Yodobashi Camera or Big Camera retail electronic stores in a box. This was the way to sell it to Japanese consumers. It was very successful. Antivirus software, Dropbox, language, they acquired a language acquisition, Rosetta Stone, and he also learned management techniques from Silicon Valley executives. He really liked the idea of stock options and how that aligned incentives. So he gave stock to most of his Japanese employees. And this is very unusual for a listed company in TSE, Tokyo Stock Exchange, to do this, but he did it. And he also realized that a lot of sort of global winner type sensibilities are cultivated here in Silicon Valley that he wouldn't get by sitting in Japan. For example, he looked at the Rakuten website, which looked fine to him. Then he looked at the Facebook site, which looked very, very subdued colors. Then he came here and realized that part of the reason most people that are Caucasian wearing sunglasses, it's literally brighter. And so the Rakuten page literally hurt the eyes of some of the people he talked to. And he thought, okay, well, this is how Facebook, they're actually subdued colors because it's bright enough. Now, I wouldn't have thought to do that kind of thing. And then he would go and talk to various people living in, he made it a point of living in the same area that Steve Jobs was, and he got inspiration walking and talking to people there. Now he lives across from Larry Page's place, and he hosts a lot of parties at his house where he gets to know people. And he has every lunch with somebody new that he hasn't met before as much as possible. And he calculated that he can meet thousands of people that way over a few years. And so trying to really absorb as much as possible. And he realized that stepping out of his context really mattered, because as the head of a Japanese listed company, you end up becoming sort of catered to. And here it's a very different logic. So he did find, interestingly enough, he had a bunch of deals that were not going forward. And then he started showing up to barbecues over weekends that some of these founders would have with his family, his wife and kids. And then all of these deals, a bunch of deals that actually had paused, went forward. So he realized maybe this is the way to establish trust instead of just a suspicious Japanese businessman. Having his family and going and establishing trust actually mattered, which went against the stereotypes that he had held that everything here is very rational and dry and straight cut. It's actually, there's a lot of sort of wet relationships there. And he actually met a bunch of Japanese here that he otherwise wouldn't. For example, the founder of Soracom, which was one of Japan's biggest startup sales. KDDI bought it within about 3 years of it being made. What it is a tiny chip that uses cell phone carriers bandwidth to make products IoT. So basically, if you, for example, a cup or a small device, and you just put a very cheap chip into it for almost no cost of transmission, you can connect it to the internet. So he met Mr. Tamagawa, who was the founder, and his brother, Mr. Tamagawa, who was here. He met them here, and so he created Poketalk, which is right now selling like hotcakes. It's a portable AI-powered instant voice translation service. It can do 74 different languages, and it translates directly into it. And it's the first eSIM-equipped translation device. So that's where he partnered with Soracom. So you can take it to many different countries, and it just works without a separate cell phone subscription. I'm generally very skeptical of these devices, but he brought one and demoed it. And before that, he brought one that was before it was made. And basically, you can talk into it, and it will produce very good Japanese. And you can talk into Japanese, and it'll produce very good English. My Tagalog and Spanish were not good enough to evaluate it, but it's also very fast. And in a live television program, when he was rolling this out in Japan, he was sweating a bit, but basically the anchor was being very mean to the machine. And she said something very long and complicated about the diet deliberation of the something committee under the ministry of so and so and so. It was very long, and it was live, and I felt very bad for him. But then the machine actually did it really well. So we've never seen anything beyond that. But then his sensibility was interesting, because you'd think in Silicon Valley the way to scale it is to just do it as an app. However, his point was that hardware, in this case, sells better because it's something tangible, and it connects using the Soracom chip, and and it's got a better directional mic and speaker than your cell phone does, at least for now. But in the back end, he actually went in, and there are a bunch of Japanese government-funded research labs that are not commercializing their machine translation technologies very well, but they tend to be very good. And they're obscure ones, like, well, if we call Japanese obscure, I'm sorry, but say Japanese to Vietnamese, or Vietnamese to different dialects of Indonesian, where they're all going directly without putting it through English ones, which is probably the way that Google Translate works. Google Translate has gotten much better since they started using machine learning, but it's still not very good. This was much better. I was quite surprised. Anyway, he enjoyed showing a stock chart, and where after he moved here, the stock went up a lot, and then he came up with this, and then it's going much higher. And he also joked that, well, this also means that maybe the president of the company moving out of headquarters led to the rise. But anyway, partnerships. IHI no Sara, and there's a couple more of these. They partnered IHI, Ishikawa Harima Industries, IHI. They do a lot of robotics. They partnered with Draper Nexus, and he went a few worst practices first. He was not able to make decisions. This is Mr. Taya that was in there. And he lacked the transparency in discussing with the startups, because he couldn't tell them what they were going to do together. And he approached by asking the startups, well, what are you going to do for us? But it should have been the opposite. So he said he learned these lessons. And they're most successful. They have several successful collaborations. Some they can talk about, some they can't yet, but that are actually factory automation robotics that are producing revenue. So that's a good success metric. Their most successful one that they can talk about is Osaro, which is basically a robot arm that uses deep learning to recognize things and sort and handle objects. It's quite accurate, and it can be used in various things. And so what they learned several lessons here on how to build relationships and to share information, because it's very difficult as a default Japanese company behavior to say, okay, here's our roadmap for how our collaboration is working with you, tiny little startup. And they'll say, okay, we're going to do this, and then you have some more meetings, and then this. And then, so for example, some of the startups that I talk that come to me say, well, all of a sudden things were moving forward, and now I'm having lots and lots of meetings. Is this just going in circles, or are we actually going somewhere? They don't tell us why are we meeting with all these people? And so I realized they have to be very transparent. So for example, yes, this is the main business unit leader. He's a little skeptical about your product. And so that's why we're trying to convince him this or that. That's not really what necessarily happened, but that's the kind of transparency that they're looking into. And of course, expedite processing, like drawing up NDAs. There are NDAs that matter and NDAs that don't matter. And so the ones that aren't really, they're not really going into your factory and maybe taking things that they can see, then maybe we make that NDA just a standard template that we don't have to agonize over, and the legal department can have a regular template. And so our relationship building. SMBC, Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation, they are running, they consolidated a lot of their various operations into one office here, and their a big chunk of their strategy is still run out of New York, where their headquarters are for the US. And the spearheading office is the Corporate Advisory Office. Their function is to try to enhance the value of their big customers. So various manufacturing companies are not, they're trying to add value to them by introducing startups and trying to harness Silicon Valley. So they've had several joint ventures and investment in strategic partnerships and a bunch of proof of concepts. And they can't tell us what they're doing. And my point is that unless you tell us what you're doing, they can't. So the point is for me to say things like that so that the people whose bosses are not letting them say things will let them say things. So, but they apparently have a lot underway. Toyota Research Institute. Now this was made a lot of headlines. It was established in 2016. There are 3 sites for Toyota Research Institute next to large research institutes and universities. And the mission is, of course, to use AI in automated driving and also do robotics. There are 2 different paradigms on what they're working. One is the Guardian, the driver assist program that helps prevent drivers from crashing. And then there's the Chauffeur. That's the one that's further down the line, fully autonomous. And then they're also doing intelligent and assistive robots. So how you can live home until a more elderly age, and also accelerated material design and discovery. This is also based on various deep learning things they're working on, but new materials using data to try to figure out how to make better car batteries and hydrogen fuel cells. They used a STAR model. They hired Gil Pratt, who was formerly at DARPA, and they have hired a large number of former Googlers and high-end software engineers, many people that can do machine learning and deep learning. They have over 300 people now. Many of the leaders are from academia, and they're very politically sensitive too after the Prius acceleration fiasco, et cetera, which turned out to be not a big deal. It was more of a political crisis. And so they got people like John Roos, who's, we all know, the former CEO of Wisconsin and ambassador to Japan. So their team is all from the outside, almost entirely from DARPA, PayPal backgrounds in places like Ford, worked with from Carnegie Mellon to Google, MIT, some people from MIT, Microsoft. Jim Adler runs their AI, Toyota AI fund now. He sold 2 companies to different large companies, one to HP, one to Microsoft, and had very different experiences. And so one good and one bad. And so he's the head of now the Toyota AI Ventures, which is a $100 million Silicon Valley fund. TRI decided that they also need to do investing, not just R&D. And so they started this fund. They do seed and series A. So they're very focused on early stage, which it's a pretty big one for early stage. Business into AI, cloud data, autonomous mobility, and robotics areas. They invested in 14 startups. That's more than doubled by now. Compact organization with investment decision committee. It's all done locally here, and it's fast. Now, he was not at our summit, but we need to talk about SoftBank. because the SoftBank Vision Fund, as a lot of us know, are really shifting how VC landscape here looks a bit. Smaller funds are not working so well, so funds are having to be bigger or move earlier stage. And a lot of it is because of Son Masayoshi's Vision Fund, and he's a little misunderstood here. I wanted to add these things because some of the analysis about him didn't understand really where he's coming from. They called him a telecom guy from Japan, etc. So these are the basic parameters you can find anywhere. The LPs, right, the big ones, Saudi Arabia, and it's huge. Just nobody's seen something this size. And his vision that he talks about all the time is hastening a machine-driven future by pouring capital into people and companies, using AI and machine learning to optimize every industry. And he has what he calls the gun senryaku, gun, not as army, but flock. So of all the various domains he invests in, he wants to have the #1 company in each domain. And by working together, these various flock companies can actually find synergies that they wouldn't find on their own. So there are many different analyses of what they are, and there's so things like Uber, right, and Grab taxi. So there's some synergies between them in what they do in Asia versus here, and they work together. And he meets each person, the entrepreneur, at least once before investing into them. And he's big on making ecosystems. So to understand his current strategy, it helps to look back a little bit. He's a third-generation ethnic Korean. He grew up quite poor in Kyushu. He's a UC Berkeley graduate. He went on his own to a community college because he didn't know English, and then he transferred to UC Berkeley, and he graduated EECS, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. He created a patent that he sold to Sharp for a sizable sum, and he then went to back to Japan and launched SoftBank, which started out as a software wholesaler. But again, he's been interested in ecosystems. So in order to sell software, he needed a more mature PC industry in Japan. So he bought a publishing company and made a magazine about PCs to get information out. And so he was the largest software distributor by the mid-90s. This company went public. He was an early investor in Yahoo, established Yahoo Japan. This was one of his big investments, big payout investments. Interestingly, at the height of the dot-com bubble here, and in Japan, the dot-com bubble, the Bit Valley area, he claimed to own more than 7% of the publicly listed value of the world's internet companies, which is probably true. When the US markets crashed, SoftBank stock fell 90% and 70 billion of his net worth was lost. So he went up and then down. And then after it was lost, he actually sped up his investments. So, and then they have a history of shocks that, again, I want more people in the US to know about. For example, shortly after stock exchanges were deregulated in Japan, the Japan's startup ecosystem suffered initially from not being able to list companies very easily. He partnered with NASDAQ, which was then in the US and expanding rapidly, to bring it to Japan, to make NASDAQ Japan. And this was a threat to the established Tokyo Stock Exchange, which then countered very quickly by making their own mother's exchange. And then NASDAQ pulled out later. Son Masayoshi then sold his portion to the Osaka Exchange. And even though NASDAQ Japan didn't succeed, he was happy because he had moved Japan from having no small market cap situation to having two. And so, and another one, because JASDAQ started. Broadband. Broadband, Japan was very slow in starting DSL because NTT wanted its own proprietary fiber-based service. DSL goes back to copper lines. NTT had invested a lot in ISDN. Those of you who remember it, it's a narrow band, proprietary, non-copper, non-fiber one. But the world thought it was going to go in that direction, but it didn't. So he created price shock by having the prevailing DSL price. And to the point where you could go to train stations and they were handing out, SoftBank people were, basically SoftBank people were handing out internet routers and saying, yeah, it's free, go install it and then join us. Very aggressive. Now, this lowered the price of DSL and caused DSL penetration to go very significantly forward. And then he started to bundle free voice over IP services. Japanese telephone landlines are very expensive. He bundled it. What he did was then, shifted the strategies of the large incumbents, NTT, KDDI. They adjusted to what he did, and then Japan itself transformed. So he's very much about starting things, becoming the catalyst, doing things that the establishment thinks are a really bad idea, but then going through with it. And in 2006, he bought Vodafone Japan, which was the largest leveraged buyout in Japan's history until then. And everybody said, this is a terrible risk. You're not going to make money. You're going to go under. And a few years later, he emerged successful. So he does these things, and these things get bigger and bigger. And so the trajectory has continued. Two other players we're just going to talk about briefly here. World Innovation Lab. Big Japanese companies trying to harness Silicon Valley. They can invest in various VCs. Will, established in 2013, is positioning itself as a very special VC. One of the things it does is it likes to take underutilized IP within large firms and spins them out into companies that are managed with Silicon Valley management. They also do a lot of corporate training for executives and mid-level people within the companies. They have offices in Tokyo and Silicon Valley. They have two funds. This is the biggest, basically, Japanese created fund for Japanese companies that has ever existed. There have been Japanese who have been significant venture capitalists, but for a fund that's focused on Japanese LPs, this is the biggest one. And, and his career, Mr. Isayama, so he started off at the Industrial Bank of Japan. He came to Stanford Business School. His world changed. He quit IBJ and then became a partner at the venture capital firm DCM. And then he became independent and started Will. So their LPs include these large companies. And some of their notable exits include Mercari, which is Japan's a Japanese company. Its US headquarters are actually right down the street there because they're trying to hire deep learning people. But Mercari, which is Japan's e-commerce, sort of like eBay, but optimized for mobile smartphones. And it was one of Japan's two unicorns, privately valued funds at companies at over 100 million. Japan's biggest IPO, and Soracom that we just talked about, and it was one of Japan's biggest M&As. It was sold for about 400 million to KDDI using intellectual property that NTT Docomo didn't need. So it was basically a very important test case of big Japanese company sitting on a lot of interesting things in their research labs that are not being monetized, pulled out, made a different added value, and then sold off. So the value of that IP went from 0 to 400 million. So a very important case, and they're trying to do this kind of, and for Mercari, they didn't push to have a very early, smaller IPO. They pushed it to get bigger and bigger, and then do a bigger IPO to prove the point that Japan's venture capitalists can aim for big IPOs. Last one, Draper Nexus, early stage VC firm, venturing mostly investing in B2B. They're also focused very much on large Japanese companies as LPs. They include some of these big companies. They've had 3 funds, about 225 million raised total, according to public information. If we're lucky, we'll get them to talk to us next month. And so the portfolio of large Japanese companies harnessing Silicon Valley usually are one of the following, but I think they should do more. Maybe all of them. Establishing an office, investing in startups directly, investing as LPs to VCs, creating one's own CVC, and partnering with universities in multifaceted ways, not just people to research labs, but bigger picture. I have a bone in this too. And then founder of CEO moves to Silicon Valley. Well, that's source next, but we saw quite interesting. So the bottom line here is to learn from own company and from other companies' mistakes and successes. This seems very straightforward, but there's been a surprising lack of this so far over the past 25 years. Many people don't know their own company was here doing certain things, and they don't know the other companies were here doing CVCs that didn't fold, etc. So what I'm trying to do through this Stanford Silicon Valley New Japan project and through this series of things and the summit is to basically provide safe spaces because you're not actually competing. People want to learn from each other, but the companies have just not been set up in ways that they can share information internally. So sometimes it needs to go outside once to go inside again, and across in a sort of a sustained community, because a lot of the people keep moving around. So that's where we'll end today. Sorry for going over time, and there will be more to come. Thank you so much.